Good morning, everybody. My name is Natalia Richardson. I'm a Ukrainian journalist based in Brussels for already 20 years. I worked for international media, Radio Free Europe, Deutsche Welle, Euronews. Now I'm independent. I thank everybody for joining. And I would like to say that today we are discussing China and human rights violations in this country. The theme of our conference is China's continuous human rights violations. Is it time to impose Magnitsky's sanctions? So we will speak about the growing and continuous problem of communist China's human rights abuses. I would like to introduce Gary Cartwright. He's a British journalist, publisher and editor of EU Today, and also a former advisor to MEPs. And also Andy Vermaat, a Belgian human rights activist, actually not only in Belgium, but worldwide. And also we have in our audience, we have Egbert Tursun, representative of the Belgian Uyghur Association. So Igbar will speak a bit later. And we also have three keynote speakers, really high-level speakers. First of all, Right Honourable Sir Ian Duncan Smith, British MP and former leader of the British Conservative Party and Secretary of State. Also, Finnish MEP Alvina Alametsa, who is from the group of the Greens in the European Parliament. And also we have Benedict Rogers, British human rights activist, co-founder and CEO of Hong Kong Watch, advisor to the World Uyghur Congress. And let me remind you about the topic of our conversation. It's about European Magnitsky Act, and we are discussing today whether it's really time to impose it worldwide. And I remind you that quite recently, in December 2020, the European Union finally passed the European Magnitsky Act that will allow the organization to impose sanctions on those who are responsible for serious human rights violations. And these sanctions originally started in the United States after the death in 2009 of a Russian tax advisor, Sergei Magnitsky, who revealed facts about corruption in tax authorities, Russian tax authorities, and he died in official custody. So these sanctions are already introduced in the United States, also Canada, and now the European Union is thinking, not thinking, but will impose the sanctions for the first time. Quite recently, like at the end of February, the European Union announced about new sanctions against 4 Russian officials that might be responsible for Alexei Navalny's poisoning. So. And now I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Right Honourable Sir Ian Duncan Smith. I would like to ask you to introduce, to say a couple of words on this topic, please.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure, obviously, to be here at this particular meeting. I think you want us to speak rather briefly. So I will try and do that. But I want to just say that right now in the House of Commons in Parliament, we are engaged in an attempt to try and link any future trade arrangements with severe human rights abuses. In this particular case, genocide. And there is a debate going on in the House of Commons with the government professing that nobody can declare genocide except a court of law, but is blocking our attempts to get a court of law in the UK to declare genocide. So this is a debate that is running at the moment, and we are trying to shift the government's position on that. But the whole issue really of China is a big problem, I think, facing the free world now, and it's one that has that most of the free world has shrugged carefully to dip their shoulders on this one and not engage directly. A lot of that is obviously to do with the reality that over the last decade, many UK businesses, many free world businesses, America is exactly the same, and in Europe and elsewhere, have in a way rushed to China to take advantage of what was essentially a much lower cost base to produce many of their goods. And that has extended itself into all sorts of interesting areas, which were exposed during the COVID outbreak, when Britain, Europe, and America were suddenly desperate to try and get hold of PPE. Every one of them pretty much had passed that over to China, and of course China had to supply itself. And there were huge problems in the early stages of COVID in getting the right protection for healthcare people. So when people talk about the advantages, they often quietly forget the disadvantages of having no control and no balance in your trade policy. And that is gone way past that. We're into, I know in the case of Germany, there is a huge reliance and dependence now on the manufacture of parts for their cars in the car industry. You go around it now, we're going to rush in the UK, and I think Europe will probably be the same as well, to get to carbon neutral status very early, in our case, in 2030. Of course, the preferred option at the moment is electricity, electrical cars and vehicles, but the biggest battery producer in the world and dominates this, of course, is China. So our dependence on China is likely to grow. They also own 85% of the world's rare earth materials, which go to the making of this thing that I'm on at the moment, as well as the batteries. They also have the largest production facility for rare earth materials in the world. And so you can see really where the pattern emerges. So China has strategically, carefully, and you have to say very cleverly, positioned itself so that much of the free world now is completely dependent on them. And in the shadow of that, we have seen the most appalling human rights abuses take place. You only have to look at what's happened to the Christians, particularly those evangelical Christians, their churches, the desecration of those, the Falun Gong, which we all know the stories about quite clearly, about the way in which far too many of them have been brutalized. And we also know that many have suffered forced organ transfers. You also got the Tibetans that I know will raise its head in this. We now discover from Professor Zhen's documents that we know that nearly 500,000 Tibetans are now in forced labor camps. And then, of course, we move our way around to the worst outbreak of all, which is in the Xinjiang region, which is the abuse that's taking place over the Uyghurs. There is no question in my mind that this certainly indicates to us that there is a form of genocide taking place here, with Uyghurs in many millions in labor camps, under forced sterilization, separated from their families, many thousands of miles away from their own homes, and Western businesses, sadly, still using some of the products of that labor, not least of which is, of course, the cotton and cotton products that come over to the UK in fashion products and to Europe very cheap. So when we add this all together, I don't think any other country in the world would have got away with this, except that, of course, because the UK and all the rest of the world are so utterly dependent and reliant now on this, that on them for business, that, of course, everyone is desperate not to upset China by too many impositions. And in the UK, we've condemned them over Hong Kong. And I'm going to come to Hong Kong last, because it is, of course, a huge issue for the UK, because, of course, we were one of the co-signatories of the Sino-British Agreement, which guaranteed the rights of people in Hong Kong on a one country, two systems basis. That has been trashed now by the Chinese government, first of all, on the new security law. And now, of course, they're not going to allow anybody to stand for LegCo, which is the Legislative Assembly, unless they are, of course, what they term, I think, as patriots. I always think the term patriot is used by those who wish to impose their own view of what patriotism is on others. The truth is that I think the greatest patriot is somebody who believes in their country so much they wish them to get everything right and to do the right thing by people's rights and responsibilities. But nonetheless, many of those who have been bravely fighting for a form of democracy and free speech are now being arrested, many sent to prison, others fleeing the country, some have come to the UK. In the midst of all of that, I'm sorry to see that the EU has decided on an economic arrangement with China, rushed through, I thought, in advance of President Biden's arrival. I think that's a great shame. I think they should have discussed it with him and with the UK, and maybe together we could have persuaded our politicians that there is a cost to these trade deals. And the longer we go on allowing China to get away with this, the worse it gets, not better. And by the way, I haven't mentioned, you'll notice, the bullying behavior on their borders in the South China Seas, on the border with India, where some Indian soldiers are being killed in those disputes. And of course, there are huge threats to Taiwan. China is a big problem. Yes, there are huge potential in China, no question at all. And we do want to deal with China. But what we have to do is accept that there is a rules-based order. There is a sense that we can't trample on people's rights. We cannot desecrate them. We cannot kill them for no other reason that they do not agree with us. And on that basis, we have to deal with China and get them to sign up to that process. So today is a very important day. I hope the whole of the European Union and the Commission, etc., is listening, because even though the UK is not in the Commission, all the governments, all those who have power need to recognize that we need to change our relationship with China.
Thank you very much, Sir Duncan Smith. And I would like to pass the floor to Chris White, who has a very important question. Chris?
Thank you. Sir Ian, very clear, and I understood fully everything you've laid out, what you've just said. But I'd like to ask you whether you have any view of the statement issued by President von der Leyen on Friday of last week, after her phone call with President Biden, in which she basically says that the EU and the US have a new partnership rooted in our shared values and principles, to quote. Now, she doesn't mention China. She doesn't mention any issues of genocide or human rights. And it looks as though the European Commission, under her leadership, has now reached an agreement with a country which has the same views as yourself. Have you any views on that statement? I mean, I don't know if you've seen it.
I hadn't actually seen it, to be fair. It's not a surprise to me, because I guess the European Union and the USA do know, with the new administration, certainly wouldn't want to fall out immediately. But I suspect underneath the surface of that, there are some quite strong comments being made by the US administration about this rush to a trade arrangement. I have a positive view that it appears to me that the European Parliament is taking a different view about or I hope it does, and certainly the word is that it is taking a different view about the proposed future relationship between China and the European Union. And I hope that they will do that. We formed an organization called IPAC, Interparliamentary Alliance on China. And it has politicians on the left and the right, parliamentarians across Europe, from Japan to Australia, New Zealand, America, Canada. It covers 20 countries now, all sharing the same view that we need to reset this relationship so that we get it quite clear that massive and enormous abuses of human rights and threatening and bullying behavior cannot be tolerated. So my answer to that really is that I hope that the president of the EU would recognize that actually there are things that are often more important than just straight trade. And if trade is conducted with regimes that abuse their people all the time and have real difficulty in understanding the concept of any kind of human rights, then it reflects rather badly on those that wish to rush to do that deal. They're not alone in this. There are many in my country that wish to do trade deals with China and become apologists for the idea that somehow that helps change China. It hasn't done. So I hope that the US will step up the pressure. The US itself has been down the wrong path, in my view, but is beginning to come back in the right direction. And I hope their leadership will tell.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Duncan Smith. And now I would like to give the floor to the Finnish MEP, Alvina Alametsa, who is from the group of the Greens. And can you tell us a couple of words about the European Parliament's position concerning China's human rights violations?
Thank you so much, participants and organizers, for this brilliant event. It's very important at this time, and I'm very happy to discuss the situation with you. Well, first I have to say, of course, that China commits crimes against humanity, crimes against international law and human rights, and we cannot stay silent at the moment. And I believe that EU, UN must do everything in their power to end this situation and stop these violations. Sadly, the momentum of this pandemic has even been used by the Chinese government to impose the national security law and crack down of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. And the acts against Uyghurs are something already discussed, but it's something we cannot be silent in. 2 years ago, EU identified China as its systemic rival. However, the practical consequences of this are still very unclear. That is what we know. And EU has not succeeded in balancing the economic interest with the values and principles that EU has. 46 years after EU has had diplomatic ties with China, the situation is perhaps more unclear than ever, and I find this very complex. China has had assertive behavior and territorial provocation in South China Sea and incursions by Chinese aircraft into Taiwan's airspace. This all has reminded EU that the security goes beyond naval presence and maritime security. It also has implications to cooperation on trade and resilient supply chains, digital transformation and connectivity. And at the same time, China has a lot of ambitions to be a global leader. They have a lot of initiatives. But do we want a global leader that has such acts and such values? EU now has increasing commitment, engagement in the Indo-Pacific. We have the new EU-Asia connectivity strategy, which seeks to advance the interests and influence of EU in Asia. And oh yes, it was just yeah. And there is also a possibility of the EU strategy on Indo-Pacific that is emerging. There's also a stronger cooperation building with India, but ironically, this suffers from the same challenges.
Colin Stevens, James Wilson. Where's James Wilson?
Ah, someone has their mic on. It's from.
Thanks.
The banks.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I'll turn it off.
No problem.
James,
okay. It's such a heavy topic that it's good to have some lightening happenings around it. Well, however, what I was saying is that that in all of these relationships, we face the same challenge with human rights and our values, and then the partnerships that EU wants and seeks. I will talk a bit about these more specifically. The ethnic and religious minorities in China are very much suffering, and the biggest case, of course, is the Uyghurs that are being silenced. There is evidence of mass sterilization, forced abortions, all kinds of violence, and these are actions that go under the UN definition of genocide. The Uyghurs are used as forced labor. They are producing products that end up also in the European market, and this is a shame. It is modern slavery. And EU must have consequences on this. We have to ban these products from entering the EU market. So this is something that we are willing to push with the Greens. EU cannot compromise the values and principles when we are dealing with China. And in my view, the China investment deal cannot be approved before there is concrete evidence of China's commitment to bettering of the human rights situation. And we are not seeing this yet. Well, I am happy that EU has finally established a human rights sanction mechanism. I think that this allows us to impose sanctions on people who are suspected on human rights abuse, and we will have more possibilities to react to situations such as this. But we also need other actions, we also need other statements. I hope that all the EU countries could together decide to boycott, for example, the Beijing Winter Olympics, and have these kind of also symbolic ways of saying what they want. We have to be able to also protect those Uyghurs that have fled from China to EU. I just last week had a conversation with a young Uyghur woman here in Finland, and she has grown most of her life here in Finland, and told that still here they have the experience of Uyghur activists in Europe, that China is spying and trying to silence these activists, even outside China's borders. And this is simply not acceptable, and we have to do more on that. Finally, to go a bit to discuss the situation in Hong Kong, China has just unveiled the plans to ensure that only patriots can govern Hong Kong. And these changes to the electoral system are the latest in the line of attacks against the democratic structures of Hong Kong. And as we speak, there are 47 people who have been fighting for their rights in Hong Kong that are facing lifetime in prison. And we cannot stand on the sidelines. The European Parliament has outlined in this recent resolution some practical measures to respond to this situation. Using trade negotiations as leverage, using targeted sanctions, supporting peaceful democracy activists, establishing an independent UN monitoring group on China, setting up lifeboat schemes to the citizens of Hong Kong. And we also should, as EU and the member states, in my opinion, take the case on China before the International Court of Justice. Because we can see that the decision to impose this national security law is breaching international law and commitments. And I believe that there is a strong support in the AFET committee on these cases. But we think in the AFET that these more assertive measures are not only needed, but they are also overdue. But then I think that there cannot be a gap between what the Parliament, Commission, and the European External Action Service do to respond to the situation in Hong Kong. Because we can see now that the Parliament has taken quite strong stances, and I hope that that will continue. Then there is a final obstacle to this, which I already briefly mentioned, the EU-China investment agreement. I wonder if the speed of the negotiations in the end has actually won over substance. The timing is terrible, and I think this serves China too well and EU too little. China can now claim that they have advanced their values while escaping the debates on environment and human rights issues, because the agreement is not impressive in neither of these, and it provides only really weak and unclear commitments. But this agreement will face plenty of opposition in the Parliament, and the consent to the agreement of Parliament is nothing but a done deal. So we will continue to work on this. Finally, it is positive that EU has condemned the China human rights violations. We also have now tools to use. But now we have to choose what are those lines that China cannot cross without consequences. And to me, those lines have already been passed. Thank you all so much for being here and having this important discussion.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Alametsa. And I would like now to give the floor to Benedict Rogers, British human rights activist, co-founder and CEO of Hong Kong Watch. And he is also advisor to the World Uyghur Congress. Can you please tell us something that wasn't mentioned beforehand, please?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be with you at this important meeting and to follow Syrian Duncan-Smith and Alvina Alametsa. It's actually very difficult to say something that hasn't already been said, because as I was listening to the previous two speakers, I felt that they were saying absolutely everything that I would say. And so there's great unity on this panel. But let me just make a few very brief comments to reinforce really what has been said. I think one of the first things I'd like to say, and I'm sure the other two speakers would echo this. But I think it's important to say, because the regime in Beijing has a tendency to use this against its critics. I am not at all anti-China. Indeed, I'm actually very deeply pro-China. I've spent much of my adult life in and around China. I first went when I was 18 years old to teach English in the city of Qingdao in China, famous for the best beer in China, although that wasn't why I went. It was a nice discovery once I was there. I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover. I was denied entry to Hong Kong in 2017 on the orders of Beijing. And it is because I'm deeply pro the people and the country of China and a great admirer of China's tremendous history and culture and civilization that I want China to be free. I want the people of China to have their human rights respected. And so it's the Chinese Communist Party regime that is the problem. And I know we all agree on that, but I thought it was important to say that. The second thing I would just reinforce is that the two issues of the Uyghurs, and I absolutely agree that that has all the indicators of genocide, and indeed it's been recognized as genocide by the United States, by the Canadian Parliament, by the Dutch Parliament. But the issue of the Uyghurs and the situation in Hong Kong, those two issues in and of themselves should be enough to justify Magnitsky sanctions and a complete reevaluation of our entire relationship, as Cyrian has outlined. But they are, of course, not the whole picture. Human rights are under the most severe assault in China, really since the Tiananmen massacre, and in some respects since the Cultural Revolution, across the board. And as Cyrian has outlined, it's Tibet, it's Christians, it's Falun Gong, it's any form of dissent, bloggers, citizen journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders. And the deterioration under Xi Jinping's leadership in particular is especially noticeable. There was a time about 12, 15 years ago where there was a certain amount of space developing in China. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party regime has always been repressive, but there was a time where, depending on the size of the group and the nature of the group, Christians could meet reasonably, not freely, but reasonably peacefully, and the authorities turned a blind eye to them. Human rights lawyers could actually operate within certain restrictions. I remember meeting a group of lawyers about 12 years ago in Beijing in a restaurant, and they told me of their work defending human rights cases. They knew that, of course, they were monitored, they knew there were red lines that they shouldn't cross, but they could operate in that space. Since then, all those lawyers that I met have either ended up in jail or have disappeared or been disbarred. So there's been a really noticeable deterioration in the last 10 years or so. Let me draw towards a conclusion by saying, firstly, to answer the question in the title, is it time for Magnitsky sanctions? Yes, absolutely. Indeed, I think it is overdue. And I think Magnitsky sanctions should be imposed on officials in the regime in Beijing, officials in Xinjiang, officials responsible for the situation in Tibet, but also officials in the Hong Kong government who are responsible for police brutality, really shocking brutality, for the complete destruction of Hong Kong's freedoms and democracy, and for grave breaches of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, an international treaty that is lodged at the United Nations. And if we allow China to violate international treaties in this way, then that poses a direct threat to the international rules-based order. But I think I agree with Alvina Alamedsa that there are other things we should be doing as well. We should be looking at how to respond to the Winter Olympics in 2022. We should be looking at mechanisms that could be created or strengthened in the United Nations, and we should be reducing our strategic dependency, diversifying our supply chains, and trying to get China out of our critical infrastructure. Let me just end by saying that in January this year, the UK Conservative Party Human Rights Commission, which is a body that I co-founded and serve as the deputy chair of, published a major report on human rights in China called "The Darkness Deepens." And it's one of the few reports that really does put all the pieces of the picture together, all the issues that I've outlined and Serene outlined, Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Tibet, and other human rights issues. And we conclude that report, and I'll end with this, with two comments. The first is we quote from the words of Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, one of the leading British lawyers who had led the prosecution of Slobodan Milosevic and who chaired the China Tribunal a couple of years ago into forced organ harvesting. And he described in his judgment at the end of that tribunal that those who are interacting with the Chinese Communist Party regime should do so in the knowledge that they are interacting with a criminal state. And then we end the report by painting a picture of the horrific repression in China and the increasing aggression beyond China's borders. And we say these words: these are the images that in their various diverse ways reveal the truth about the mendacity, brutality, inhumanity, insecurity, and criminality of the Chinese Communist Party regime. And for those reasons, we absolutely need Magnitsky sanctions as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Benedict Rogers. And I think that now we have a couple of questions for the last two speakers. Gary, do you have questions from journalists?
I've got a couple of questions which I'd like to really put, and these are to any of the panelists, any of the speakers who would care to answer. I'd be welcome to hear everybody's opinion. Firstly, on the sanctions, Magnitsky sanctions. We know that the sanctions against Russia have worked. They've worked very well. They've done a great deal of damage to Putin's popularity at home. They've cost his cronies a great deal of money, We know that these sanctions are successful because the Russian state-controlled media spends a lot of time telling us they're not successful. They work. However, my first question really is, whilst these sanctions work against Russia, they're directed against a regime. We know that Vladimir Putin is not going to live forever. We don't know what comes next, but we can be optimistic. We've got very good reasons to be optimistic. There's been a lot of change in Russia over the last 30 years. I think that with China, are we talking about a different model altogether? Is there going to be any change? My personal feeling is that what we see in China is what we're always going to have. I look at the history of China and I see these images of the Communist Party at its various meetings. And I'm always reminded of the words of Charlie Chaplin in The Great Dictator: machine men with machine minds, machine hearts, men who drill you diet, who tell you what to do. Those words kind of run through my mind. Will the sanctions bother them, or will they simply pass the pain on to their own people? Will we have unity across the world? We are seeing sanctions imposed in the US. The EU is moving very, very slowly, although the legislation's in place. To put that legislation in place and to then announce this investment deal. This cannot be correct. I would like to know what the speakers think about this. A boycott of the Olympics. We all remember the Berlin Olympics, Hitler's Olympics, and remember the Sochi Winter Olympics. Days after that, Putin launched his troops into Crimea. Do we really want to hand China another propaganda coup, or do we boycott? And if we do boycott, we should really send that message out very quickly. And my final one, Mr. Rogers, you said that it would be difficult to say anything different to the other speakers because everybody seems to be, singing from the same hymn sheet. Well, this is because we know what's right and we know what's wrong. And dealing with a regime like this is plain wrong. Why can we not act on what we know?
Yes, please. Alvina Alamezza and Benedict Rogers, that was the questions for you.
Thank you so much for these excellent questions. Yes, for example, here in Finland, a lot of people say that sanctions don't work, and it's a mantra that we have really learned. But we still have a lot of evidence that they do work, and they are just one tool that we have to use. And I am very hopeful, at least, that with these sanctions, we could have also changes to the actions of China. Of course, the situation is more difficult in that sense that the media is even more governed by the state. But then on the other hand, there is still social media and other platforms that are emerging, and also there is maybe, I hope so, in the future, more possibilities to share the right information. And I agree definitely with the Winter Olympics. I think that, you know, we have to use many kinds of methods, because all of them might not work perfectly. Some of them might work really well. Some of them might not work at all. But we have to use those that we have in our arsenal. And we have also analysis, what will work and what will not. What I know is that if we go forward with this China investment deal, if we go forward with the Olympics, then we just give China these arms to use in a way. And we are just kind of clarifying that cooperation with them is acceptable for us. And to me, in this situation, it's not acceptable. But we have to take human rights as a core value to all of these things that we do with China. And that has to be a commitment. Thank you so much. It's a really good point and really good question.
Thank you. Just to add to that, again, I agree with everything that's just been said. I think that the thing that is good about Magnitsky sanctions, and I would also like to see targeted sanctions at enterprises that are complicit in human rights violations and strategically key to the regime, and particularly the People's Liberation Army. But the key thing about these targeted sanctions is that they can hit those responsible for these crimes against humanity in their pockets, and they're much more likely to be effective than broad-based sanctions that hit the people and the country as a whole. And I think if we can accompany the sanctions by the narrative that that this is about the CCP, not about China, that will be helpful in trying to create a distinction and a divide between the people of China and the party. The party likes to see itself as the country, as the state, and for Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party to be one and the same. And if we can create a separation and a distinction, and so that ordinary Chinese people might begin to wonder, well, why are our leaders being sanctioned? That, in the long run, may be helpful. I completely agree on the with regard to the Olympics, and I mean, either a boycott, or if we can put pressure on the IOC to think about moving the Olympics, even at this late stage. I know time is running out for that, but my understanding is that some political groups in Canada have called for this and offered Canada as an alternative location. There are a number of European countries, of course, that would have the capability to host Winter Olympics as well. And so either a boycott or pressure on the IOC to withdraw the games from Beijing and move them to another location. And lastly, in terms of the question of yes, we're all united because we know what's right. Why are other countries, why are countries and politicians, some politicians, slow on this? I suppose it's a combination of putting short-term economic interests first. Also, I think a certain naivety in the past, which people are starting to wake up to, but a naivety in the past that we can turn a blind eye to what's happening, or a belief that in order to trade, we have to kowtow to this regime. I think that to varying degrees and at varying levels of speed, people are waking up to this. Certainly in the UK, the political mood, thanks in large part to the efforts of Syrian and others, has shifted considerably. When I wrote a report in 2016, which was called The Darkest Moment, rather unfortunate title given that things have got even darker since then, but the reception was extremely unfriendly towards it in certain political circles in Westminster, and definitely I and my colleagues were not at all popular at that time. The reception to our latest report has been very different, including at levels in government. There's still a lot more we want to push the government on, but definitely the attitude has shifted somewhat, and certainly in Parliament it's shifted very considerably. And I think there are probably four reasons for that, four issues that have come almost simultaneously. The exposure of the regime's handling of the pandemic in its very early stages, the suppression of the truth about the pandemic and suppression of whistleblowers. Secondly, the debate around Huawei. Thirdly, the emergence of the really shocking evidence of what's happening to the Uyghurs. And fourthly, the situation in Hong Kong. And I think those four issues have woken people up, or are starting to wake people up. Some European countries may be taking a bit longer to get there, although I was very encouraged by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's tour of Europe last year, where actually in every capital his counterparts raised Uyghurs and Hong Kong and other issues publicly in a way that I think a short time before we might not have expected them to. So I think things are shifting. They need to shift much faster and much more robustly, but hopefully we can get there. And that's why debates like this today are so important.
Thank you very much, Alvina Alamedza and Benedict Rogers. And now let's move to our next speakers who will share their knowledge about Tibet and also Uyghurs. We will start with Andy Vermaat, who is a Belgian human rights activist, and not only Belgian, but around the world. Let me remind you that he was in Nepal several years ago, and he was in close contact with people from Tibet who told Andy a lot about their experience with human rights violations. And Andy is also an advisor to the International Alliance for the Defense of Rights and Freedoms. Andy, can you please say a couple of words about Tibet and also about the environmental issues and problems with this as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Gary Cartwright, for organizing this on a Monday, because I like Mondays because they are new beginnings. And I hope one day that all the Tibetans will one day get these new beginnings. They can be the beginning of a real change for the people of Tibet. And I believe the Tibetan spring will come. I feel privileged and honored to be invited here today as a speaker, where I hope also Europe can make a sort of European Tibetan policy act with the External Action Service. I hope this is not an idle hope, because the United States did it. They made a Tibetan Policy and Support Act, and it was passed with 392 votes of the 35 people there. So a majority of 93% of the people of in the European United States Chamber was actually supporting this. If I talk about Tibet, I want to ask the people in the audience, do you know that Tibet is not a small part of China? It's a very big part. Not a lot of people are aware that it's 2.5 million square kilometers. So it's a very big part of China. It's 1/5 of China. So that's really important to know, because I always thought before this speech, I always thought this was a very small part, but it's actually a very big part. Some days ago, the 5th of March, there was the presentation of the Freedom House regarding the Freedom Index. They make every year an index of freedom of all the countries in the world. And for 4 years in a row, Tibet was the second least free region in the world. But the 5th of March, they became the first least free region in the world after Syria, because before it was Syria, was the leading least free region in the earth, and now it's Tibet. Not a lot of people are aware about that. So it's more easy to go as a human rights activist to North Korea than to go to Tibet. It's more easy to go as a diplomat to North Korea than to Tibet. It's more easy to, as a human rights or a journalist, to go there. So that's also something that I wasn't aware about. What is actually happening there? Not the people are aware, not a lot of people are aware. Why are they not aware? Because journalists are simply not allowed. Human rights activists are not allowed. So what happened? Since 2011, 155 people were self-immolating them, burning themselves. And is somebody knowing why they are doing this act of self-immolation? Are people aware why they are doing that? So they are doing this because if they are taken, if they are going to protests, they are taken into prison, and these prisons are sometimes 500 kilometers away. So the family doesn't have immediately visitation rights to visit their friends, their son, their daughter, their husbands. So they have to wait for some weeks. They have to go 500 kilometers away to the prison to give food and to give clothes to these people. So therefore people are self-immolating because they want to spare their families. Because most of the time these people are 5 years in prison. 5 years, 10 years in prison, 15 years in prison. So that's the reason why people are self-immolating. And we don't see this in the media. We don't see this in the news. 155 people did it since 2009. So when I want to come to the aspect of the environment, the Tibetan plateau is a really important place is really important because why? There are more than 124 minerals that they found there. There are also very big rivers. I will put my papers here, it's better like that. Very big rivers, the China River, the Indus River, 40% of the glaciers melting water of the Indus River comes from the Tibetan plateau. And not a lot of people are aware that the Tibetan plateau is melting. And in the last 30 years, 50% of the Tibetan plateau melted away. There is still some Tibetan plateau left, but under this Tibetan plateau who is left, there is permafrosts. There is more than 10 million carbon dioxide under the Tibetan plateau, but there is also the gas very poisonous for nature, the methane gas. And this is 28 more poisonous than carbon dioxide. So this is melting. This can have a huge impact.
For the whole world, you mean?
For the whole world. And what do we see? United Nations Climate Panel, they don't talk about the Tibetan plateau. They talk about Himalaya, but they don't dare to talk about the Tibetan plateau because they don't want to use the Tibetan word in their studies. So this is a big disaster. But next to that, 70%, Ian Duncan-Smith talked about lithium, 70% of the lithium comes from mines in Tibet. The people are used in work camps there to work there in the mines. And they sell this lithium very cheap to Chinese companies, but foreign companies have to pay much more. Just as Ian Duncan-Smith said also, 85%, now it's even more, 90% of the rare earths who is used that we need for satellites, that we need to make protection missile systems, everything, it comes from China and it comes from Tibet. And these people are exploited for this, but they sell it for 1/10 of the price to the Chinese companies, and they sell it 10 times more to other countries. We are really dependent on these rare earth materials. But next to that, there is also a big human disaster, next to the climate disaster, human disaster. More than 1.2 million people have died since 1949, since the Chinese occupation started there. So it's not only a climate disaster, but this disaster has an impact also on the people there themselves. So I'm really astonished to see also the pollution of these lithium mining. They use a lot of chemicals to do this mining, and these chemicals are polluting these sources, these rivers who go to India, who goes to Pakistan, who goes to Kashmir. All this is polluted there. So I think it's really important that we could have this Tibetan Support Policy Act, but also have a big focus on the climate and on the pollution who is made there.
Thank you, Andy. And I think some environmental activists are already in prison, yeah?
Yes, we see now China is exposing themselves as being the leaders in climate change. Right? And they put some environmental activists 15 years in prison if they want to protect nature in Tibet. So there are activists in the Tibetan Plateau who wanted to talk about the endangered species, who wanted to protect the endangered species, and these people die in prison. In the meantime, they say, oh yeah, we are the leaders in climate change. We will follow the Paris Agreement. But they put their own leaders the environmental leaders into prison.
Thank you very much, Andy. Indeed, very, very interesting and shocking, of course. And now I would like to give the floor to Egbert Tursun, representative of the Belgian Uyghur Association, and I'm sure he will tell us also interesting facts.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Egbert Tursun. I am from Antwerp, Belgium. I am Uyghur from East Turkestan or Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China. And I am member of Belgium Uyghur Association. And this association represents the Uyghur community in Belgium. And this association fights for the human rights and freedom of the Uyghurs. And this association fights against the genocide committing by Chinese government. And we are very active in entire Belgium. We organize political activities, for example, protest, mass gathering in front of the Chinese embassy, in front of the European Commission, in front of the European Parliament, and also the popular places in Brussels, to get attention of the people for the Uyghur issue, to get to demand the reaction from the European leaders to act, to take an effective action against the Chinese government. And we also socially active in Belgium. We organize different kinds of social activities, and gathering and traditional festivals, and also the contest for the Uyghur children, because the social gathering and the traditional activities are prohibited by the Chinese government today. So in our country, the 5 or 6 Uyghur peoples, they can't come together to celebrate something, to make conversation with each other. And our language, the Uyghur language, is banned in our country by the Chinese government. So we are in Belgium to educate our children with Uyghur language. We run Uyghur language school, and we do in Belgium everything that we can do in our country. And also we work together with World Uyghur Congress, a very important organization for the Uyghurs, activate Uyghur issue in the world. And we work together with a United Nations People's Organization in Brussels to organize activities and other important events. And Uyghur community in Belgium, there are approximately more than 2,000 Uyghurs in Belgium, in which more than 200 Uyghurs are from East Turkestan or the Chinese occupied Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And this region is occupied in 1949. And before that, we had established 2 times our independent country, like Tibet. So we were occupied in 1949, and after 6 years, 1955, if I'm not wrong, Tibet was occupied by the Chinese government. And maybe you are all aware of the current issue of the Uyghurs, which was started in 2017. The Chinese government has brought a former Tibetan party secretary of party to our region, and after his coming, he started with very hard policy, which is called re-education for the Uyghurs, and a lot of camps have been established in entire region. And today there are more than 1,200 re-education camps. I say concentration camps in the entire region. China said we re-educate people. Uyghurs are not normal people, so we re-educate them and to make them as normal people. Look at the picture. Can you? Yes, this one. So in the picture, so all the peoples are Uyghur intellectuals. They are singers, they are historians, and some of them are writers, lawyers, artists, even the athlete, professor, doctors, teacher, and the students. Actually, these are the people who educate the Uyghurs. These are the people who are very important for the Uyghur community, for the Uyghur nation. And how come the Chinese government educates them? They are qualified in Chinese. They can speak perfect Chinese. They can manage computer. They have their own professional knowledge. Why the Chinese government educates them? Chinese government declared we educate Uyghurs so they can learn in the re-education camp Chinese and other skills to find a job. But they had a job. They have already had a job. And there are many reasons for the Chinese government to send the Uyghurs to re-education camp or concentration camp. And there are a few reasons that I will indicate. So contacting with someone in a foreign country is enough for Chinese government to send the people to the camp. So that's why since 2017, the Uyghurs in diaspora, they cannot contact with your family members, with your friends in Xinjiang Uyghur, so-called Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So we are, since that time, we are deleted or blocked by them in social media, in app. So we cannot communicate with each other. We don't know. So everyone, it's very easy for now to everyone to communicate with each other by phone, by SMS, but Uyghurs, we can't. And having family members in a foreign country is enough reason to send the people in the camp. And not returning from the abroad. So the Uyghurs who are studying abroad or traveling from abroad, and if they don't return, and the Chinese government, they go to their family and look, you have family members, you have sister, or you have brother or son, so he has to come, he has to return, otherwise you will be in camp. And it happened. In 2017, there are many Uyghur students in Egypt who are studying there. They did not return, and their family members are sent to the camp. And who returned to China, and they were disappeared at the airport. We have no news. And after a couple of days, we have heard via news that some of the Uyghur students who returned from Egypt to China are in prison, and after some months, they were dead, which was confirmed by Radio Free Asia, based in Washington. And travel abroad, the Chinese government, it was very difficult for the Uyghurs to apply for a passport. But in 2016, the Chinese government was very friendly for the Uyghurs, and they made it very soft. So Uyghurs can apply for passport like Chinese, and they can get their passport within 2 weeks with a normal procedure. And then Uyghurs have passport, and then they went abroad to travel, to see the world, and after they are coming back, and Chinese government interrogates them, where is this person, and in abroad, and with who this person was in contact in abroad. And then they were all sent to the camp. So making the passport procedure easy for the Uyghur is a first step or the excuse to get the Uyghurs in the camp. And the religious, and the Uyghur people are, most of them are Muslim people, and the Uyghurs who have prayed at home or in their places, or who have kept religious books or documents, they were sent to the camp because those people are regarded as extremists, as terrorists. Next slide, please. And what is happening outside the camp? So inside the camp, the Uyghurs are tortured, brainwashed, beaten, killed, and every very serious tragedy is happening inside the camp. Now, what about outside? The Uyghur girls, the ladies, they are forced to marry with the Han Chinese. It's just assimilation. If no, then the entire family members should go to the camp, because those people are not respecting the rule of Chinese Communist Party. And what about the young children, the small children? There are many young parents inside the camp, and their children are left behind, and those children are sent to the so-called the Chinese the orphanage or the state-run kindergarten. But actually, it is a camp for the children. And according to the news, there are 500,000 Uyghur children are separated from the Uyghur family. And also the forced labor is occurring. According to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, there are more than 80 brands, Chinese and international brands, are linked with the Uyghur forced labor, including Nike and Zara. And sterilization is happening against Uyghurs. And next slide, please. And she is Zumrat Dawud. She is a camp survivor. She was in camp for 3 months in 2018, and she's now in the United States of America. And she was sterilized first and then sent to the camp. And this guy, next, Nur Ahmed Kurla, he's a Uyghur guy living in Belgium. He was studying in Egypt, and his parents, his father was threatened by the Chinese police. And the father told this guy, son, you should leave from Egypt and go somewhere which is safe for you. And his wife was pregnant at this moment, and she wanted to give birth at home. So she returned to China, and when she arrived, her passport was confiscated by the Chinese government, and he cannot see his wife. And the second son was born in China, but he doesn't have any photo, any video of his son. he was not able to see the face of the newborn baby. And this lady, next slide, please. Rehan Gultokhti. She is living in Antwerp, Belgium, and she has 7 family members, brothers, sisters, mothers, are in camp or in prison. And her one brother was killed by the Chinese authority. And she was in the media, in Belgian media, in French-speaking and Dutch-speaking Belgian media. And there are many Uyghurs who have the family problem in Belgium. We are threatened regularly by the Chinese government, by the Chinese secret police, just sending us SMS, trying to contact us, go to our family, threatens them, that makes them to encourage us to contact with the Chinese police. If we don't do, then they will be in, our parents, our family members will be in problem. And they ask us, look, send us your Belgian residence permit, send us your ID card, send us your the house contract, even send us the school. Which school are you going to? So we are safe in Belgium, but actually we are not 100% safe in Belgium. We reported this issue to the Belgian Foreign Ministry. We reported this issue to Belgium Intelligence Service to take an action. And in January, the United States of America, the former US government has officially recognized action of China against Uyghurs as genocide. And last month, in February, the Canadian Parliament and Dutch Parliament have recognized the crime of China as genocide. And we heard from our Uyghur community in Australia that in 15 March, there will be a discussion in Australian Parliament and to vote if it's genocide or no. It's good news. And also a resolution for Uyghur genocide is submitted by French-speaking Belgian Parliament, Belgian Party, and Dutch-speaking Belgian Party to the National Parliament. So I heard that there will be a discussion in Belgian Parliament. So hopefully Belgium will follow the step of Canada, US, and Holland. So I hope just internationally there should be an action together that must stop China. Otherwise, every day we are losing lives of our parents, of our people inside China under the Chinese regime. So we should act before it's too late. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ekbar, for this shocking, I would say, examples of human rights abuses with Uyghur minority. And I think we would like to ask a couple of questions. Yes, Gary?
Well, I think there's really just one final question, and it touches upon genocide. And I'd like to ask our speakers for their thoughts on why it appears to be so difficult, given the evidence, to persuade individual governments globally, member states of the EU itself. Why is it so difficult to simply recognize this for what it is, which is an act of genocide? If we look at the defining features, the defining facts of genocide, this ticks all the boxes. The treatment of the Uyghur people ticks all the boxes. Why is it so difficult for governments to accept this and to acknowledge it?
Yeah, of course you can.
Should I come into it? Or?
Yes, I think you
yes,
should.
Please,
Surian. I'd like to hear from Surian.
Okay, I think the problem with the charge of genocide, it is agreed by everybody since the first signing. That is often termed as the crime above all crimes. So the idea that genocide can be used to describe events in another country is one that has to be done really rarely, in the sense that the evidence must be beyond reasonable doubt. Well, beyond that, in a sense, I would call it in almost a criminal level of requirement. And that means the evidence has got to be strong. But the other dispute that comes of this is that, for example, the UK government, as I said earlier on, takes the position that only a competent court can decide whether genocide has happened. And of course, whilst that is a very good principle because it stops politicians banding around the term genocide, it has a problem, because if it's meant to go to the international courts to be decided and evidence heard there, that's fine, except that both in the International Criminal Court and in the Court of Justice, access to them becomes very difficult. In the one, China isn't a signatory, and in the other, you can block this through the Security Council. So what happens with Russia and China is that any state that they consider to be friends or allies, they will block any reference, and of course for themselves, they will block that too. And not being signatories in the case of China to the other court means that literally they can't be tried in that court for genocide. So straight away, your problem is that on the international scene, it's been very difficult to get a genocide. In fact, I don't think there's been a case of a genocide that is happening that has ever in 75 years been found to be the case. It only seems to happen, if found at all, after the event, and then invariably by those who have succeeded in whatever military adventure there is in decrying a genocide that happened in that area. So this is the base problem. So in our problem in the UK is the government sticks rigidly to this idea that only a court can decide. And then when we tested this and have tested it with our amendment in the Lords, which has come back now, this is the third time of asking, slightly different patterns in each occasion, the government maintains that position. So they won't decide, as Canada or America has, that there is genocide. They refuse to do that. But at the same time, when we said, well, in that case, let us have a UK court hear the case and decide on balance, beyond all reasonable doubt, that a genocide is likely to be being committed, the government said no, because they got tied up in knots on this one. They said no, they couldn't, because this is a matter for Parliament, not for the court. But at the same time, they then said only a court can decide. So you can see what's going on here, which is the government has for years, all governments managed to fend this off by saying only courts can decide. And then when you challenge them by saying, let's have a domestic court decide, well, domestic courts can decide when it comes to individuals who have been involved in genocide. But they refuse to allow a UK court to decide whether a state can decide genocide. And for that matter, we've introduced it with the trade arrangements so that such a decision could be invoked were a bilateral trade agreement to be formed in some shape or other. Say, for example, if the UK had been involved in this recent economic deal, then of course that would have triggered this, but we still can't get that. So, so what's happening really, and we should clear all this away. The reason why genocide literally in the UK cannot be found is because I think the government genuinely thinks that by decreeing this, and of course it is a huge allegation to make that a country is guilty of genocide. It is the single worst crime that one could imagine. To do that would, of course, and they've been told this by the Chinese, would upset the Chinese dramatically, and they would retaliate in various ways. So the problem we've got right now is the free world is divided on calling it genocide. And if Parliament calls it genocide, it's not the same thing really, because first of all, government can say, well, only a court can decide that. And so that's the end of it. And I think therefore it demeans it if only Parliament can call it. So the whole thing is in a mess, which means that we are drifting, unable to make the statement that a country, in this particular case, China, could have been Burma with the Rohingya, is guilty of genocide. And that, of course, has huge implications. So that's our problem, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, sir. And probably just a couple of words, Ekbar.
The Chinese government controlled every news very strictly, so it's very hard for the investigators to get the evidences that China is making genocide. So we cannot receive, even we cannot contact with our people in our country. So for the countries, for the international groups, it's very hard. And also the Chinese government did not allow the independent investigators into the region to see what is going on in the region, to see what the camp look like in the region. So that this can be one of the factor that the making the genocide, making the definition of the genocide for some countries. But I hope it will be soon solved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iqbal. And Andy, just a couple of words, please.
Yes, actually, China is trying in the Human Rights Council to redefine human rights. Yeah. So redefining the idea of human rights. For example, asking the question, do you have enough food? Do you have enough shelter? If you have enough food and enough shelter, oh, your human rights are not abused. So that's one of the things that you are trying to organize. So a lot of countries don't dare to talk about the human rights in China because they have economic cooperation agreements with China. But Europe should have given an example with the investment trade policy agreement that they made with China. But they have chapters, they're always very beautiful written chapters on human rights in every agreement. But they are only recommendations. They are not obliged to follow. So they always put a very beautiful word. So I could not make it myself, these beautiful words that they make about human rights. Next to that, we also have the Chinese Constitution. The Chinese Constitution of 1982 and the Minority National Act of 1984, where they stated that you should encourage, that Chinese should encourage that people should talk their own language if they are not from Chinese origin. This is in the Constitution. But it's not followed. One example is Tashi Wangchuk. He was a Tibetan guy. He asked the local authorities in Tibet to have also education in his own Tibetan language. So it was not allowed. Then he went to Beijing to ask if it's possible to follow this constitution. And they put him in prison. He was 5 years in prison, just to ask to have education in his own language. It's the same with the Uyghur. And why are they doing this? 55 minorities there are in China in total, 55 minorities. So actually the Chinese population, 60% of the Chinese population are formed of minorities. So they have very beautiful words. They have very beautiful acts. They have very, very beautiful laws, but they are not followed. So we as Europeans always think, and United States people also always think, law is the solution. Law is the solution, international agreements are the solution. But for China, it's not the solution. For example, we had Mary Robertson, the president of Ireland. She was also an Irish human rights commissioner. She went to Tibet with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She gave it to the people there. And when people are took with it, where people, the authorities saw that people had this declaration with it, they were put in prison for 5 years. So we really need observation teams on the ground, but they don't have access. So the world doesn't know it. So that's the reason why they can act like this. So we need to have this Europe to get the conscience. We need this Europe to not doing business with countries who are actually abusing human rights. That's the solution, but it doesn't happen because of economic reasons.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andy, indeed. And I just wanted to ask whether somebody else has any questions.
Yes, I do. I was hoping to ask Sir Ian Duncan-Smith the question about human rights, which has just been raised by Andy. The big question I've got really, are we looking at a lack of unity across Europe because of lobbying? I read the other day of the billions spent by lobbyists in Brussels, and of course it's business. So to sum up quickly, can we not act on human rights rather than genocide and do something and get some unity? But the other thing is the root problem some form of problem with lobbying?
Well, two things to say about this. One is that I'm going to have to leave this meeting quite shortly because I have another meeting at 12:30, forgive me. But in answer to this question, all things at the end of it are in politics a balance. If we just followed every suspicion of human rights and there were issues and problems to block everything, then we wouldn't get any dialogue at all. So I can understand governments wanting to see whether dialogue can improve the nature of what is going on. And of course, one of the areas of dialogue is trade. But the difference between disputes and debates about human rights, which are really important, and genocide is a quantum difference. If genocide is beyond reasonable doubt being committed by a state, it is 75 years ago, it was made the crime of all crimes. In other words, that you should not, therefore, have dealings with a state that is in this position, because it comes out of the back of the Second World War, and we saw what happened in the run to the Second World War with the refusal to accept the nature of the regime in Germany, what we called in the UK appeasement, in the hope that somehow this would change them. In fact, it didn't do anything else but just fed them with their own ability to strengthen. So my concern on the answer to that question is very simple, that governments have to make decisions and balance this. And the free world signs up to human rights. There are disputes about different acts of human rights or failure to act. But I think in the case of genocide, it's a different game. Huge issues and arguments around Hong Kong. There are other mechanisms, Magnitsky sanctions and others. These are destined and tried, and even full international sanctions. But the reason why I think genocide is different is because it is such a crime. When you set out as a government deliberately to get rid of, to exterminate an ethnic group, and it is policy to do so from the top to the bottom, if that is demonstrated, that puts that state out on the side as a pariah state, and quite rightly so. And that is why governments are always reluctant, and I understand this, to bandy this term around. And I actually do accept the UK government's position that ultimately a court has to decide this. But my problem right now is that how do we get that heard? And this needs to be sorted out and changed.
Thank you very much, sir. And I would like to ask our second keynote speaker, Benedict Rogers, if he has any comments or questions. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Well, I also will have to leave in a few minutes as well. But I just wanted to say on the question of genocide, and Cyrian has answered that extremely comprehensively. I just wanted to make one additional point that I think is really important, which is that certainly in the UK at least, and perhaps in other countries, the community that has really been out front leading the calls for recognition of the genocide of the Uyghurs and action to stop it is the Jewish community. And it is, of course, extremely rare and extremely sensitive for the Jewish community to make comparisons with the Holocaust. But they have done so. The president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews wrote a powerful letter to the Chinese ambassador last year, explicitly drawing comparisons with the Holocaust. The chief rabbi has done the same. The Jewish News is, I think, the only newspaper to have run stories about the Uyghurs on its front page multiple times and campaigned for the genocide amendment. And I think that's extremely significant. And whilst Cyrian's exactly right about the need for an extremely high threshold of evidence and the government's position about the need for this to be determined by the courts, if we don't listen to the voice of the Jewish community on something as significant as this, then something is very wrong. So I wanted to just add that extra point into the discussion. But it's been a privilege to be with you today, and thank you for holding this very important meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. Indeed, a very important remark. And now I would like to say that we are finishing for today. I thank you very much for your participation in this lively and important discussion. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarian.